Hey everyone, and welcome back to class. This week we're talking about knowledge. So we're still in epistemology. We're still in Unit 4, but this is the last week of Unit 4. So this week I'll send out the Unit 4 assignment. Next week will be our last week, and we'll talk about bullshit. If you think this whole class has been about bullshit, that's your view. But next week we'll be talking about bullshit as a concept. The concept of bullshit will be our topic. But this week we're still on epistemology, so we're talking about knowledge. So today we're going to talk about the question, what is knowledge, and what an answer to that question looks like. We're going to talk about the difference between knowledge and true belief. And we're going to look at some potential answers to the question, what is knowledge? We'll look at the answer Socrates gives in the Meno, which is written by Plato, but Socrates is sort of the main character in all of Plato's work. And then we'll look at justified true belief, which sort of stems from the Socratic answer. And then we'll look at Gettier problems, which are problems for the justified true belief account of knowledge. So I'm going to break this up into a couple different videos, so hopefully none of them will be too long. Now, first things first. What does an answer to our question look like? Because the question that we want to answer is, what is knowledge? Or what does it mean to know something? Right? So in the last 2 weeks, we've looked at arguments for and against skepticism about the external world. We've looked at arguments that we don't know anything about the external world, about the world outside of our own minds. And we've looked at G.E. Moore's attempt to prove that we do have knowledge of the external world. G.E. Moore says that we know that we have hands, even if we can't prove that we have hands. So you might ask, well, what are we even talking about when we ask whether or not we know anything about the external world? What does it mean to know something? If you're trying to decide who's right, G.E. Moore or the skeptics, what knowledge is going to matter there, right? Whether or not it's possible to know that we have hands without proving them, like G.E. Moore thinks we do, whether or not that's true, it's going to depend on what knowledge is, what it takes to know something. If knowing something is the kind of thing that requires a proof, then G.E. Moore is wrong. But if knowledge is something less that doesn't require a proof, then G.E. Moore might be right. So what knowledge is going to make the difference, really, in whether or not we know anything about the external world. And so when philosophers ask what is knowledge, what they're looking for is an analysis of the concept of knowledge. So that means they want necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge. And this is an important point, and it will appear on the unit assignment. What are necessary and sufficient conditions? So a necessary condition for knowledge is anything that it is necessary to have in order to have knowledge, right? So you have to have it in order to have knowledge. You can't have knowledge without it. If X is a necessary condition for knowledge, then you can't have knowledge without X. If you don't have X, then you don't have knowledge. Now, what is X? What is a necessary condition? Well, we'll talk about that. One proposed necessary condition is belief. If you don't believe that something is true, then you can't possibly know that it's true. You can't know something unless you believe it, unless you think it's true. That's just part of knowledge. And so belief is often taken to be a necessary condition for knowledge. If you don't believe that something is true, then you can't possibly know that it's true. That would be a necessary condition for knowledge. But X is a sufficient condition for knowledge if having X is sufficient for having knowledge, if X is all it takes to have knowledge. So that means if you have X, then you have knowledge. X is all you need for knowledge. Once you have X, then you are guaranteed knowledge. So one thing that we might think is a necessary or is a sufficient condition for knowledge might be proof. If you have proved that something is true, then you know that it's true. A proof might be sufficient for knowledge. Now, maybe a proof isn't necessary for knowledge, right? G.E. Moore thinks you can't prove here is a hand, but you still know that here is a hand. But he thinks that once you've proved something, then you know it. So he thinks he provides proof of an external world, and that suffices to show that we have knowledge of the external world. So G.E. Moore thinks that a proof is sufficient for knowledge. So proving something is a sufficient condition for knowing something. But proving is not necessary. It's not a necessary condition for knowing something. Right? So these can come apart. A necessary condition is not necessarily sufficient, and a sufficient condition is not necessarily necessary. Right? G.E. Moore thinks proof is sufficient for knowledge, but is not necessary for knowledge. Whereas belief is probably necessary for knowledge. If you don't believe it's true, then you can't know it. But belief definitely isn't sufficient for knowledge. You can believe all kinds of stuff without knowing for sure that it's true. Just because you believe something, that doesn't mean you know it. So belief is necessary for knowledge, but not sufficient. So these can come apart. A proof is sufficient but not necessary for knowledge, according to G.E. Moore, and belief is necessary but not sufficient. You can't have knowledge without belief, but having belief isn't by itself enough. And maybe you can have knowledge without a proof, but you can't have a proof without knowledge. Once you prove it, you know it. That's it. You're done. You do have knowledge then. And so there might be some necessary conditions for knowledge. There might be some sufficient conditions for knowledge. But what we want, what philosophers want when they ask what is knowledge, what does it take to know something? What they want is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. They want to have a set of conditions, each of which is necessary for knowledge and together are sufficient for knowledge. Right? So a set of conditions where each one is necessary and the group together is sufficient. So if you don't meet these conditions, you don't have knowledge. If you do meet these conditions, then you do have knowledge. That's a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. If you meet all these conditions, then you've got knowledge. If you don't meet these conditions, then you don't have knowledge. So you have knowledge if and only if you meet these conditions. So here's an example of a necessary condition, right? Truth. If you know something, it must be true. Which means if it's not true, then you can't possibly know it. Knowledge is what they call factive. You can only know facts. You can only know things that are true. If that's just part of the meaning of the word to know, or the verb to know. You can only know true things. So if you know something for sure, then it must be true. And if it's not true, then you can't possibly know it. So, like, if today isn't Wednesday, then you can't possibly know that today is Wednesday because it's not Wednesday. So that means that in order to even have a chance of knowing something, that thing must be true. The only way you can possibly know that today is Wednesday is if it is actually Wednesday. The only way you can possibly know that it is raining is if it's actually raining. There's no way that you can know it's raining and it's sunny outside, because then you're wrong that it's raining. If you think it's raining and it's not raining, then you're mistaken. You don't know it because you're wrong. So truth is a necessary condition for knowledge. If it's not true, then you don't know it. Whatever the thing that you allegedly know is, whatever fact you claim to know, that fact has to be true in order for you to know it. So truth is a necessary condition for knowledge. But truth is not a sufficient condition, right? The fact that a statement is true doesn't mean that you know it's true. There are lots of things that are true that no one knows. Solution to quantum gravity, for example, in physics, or the exact number of electrons in the universe. No one knows that. There's an answer there. No one knows that. If truth were a sufficient condition for knowledge, then everyone would know every true statement. But then there would be no disagreements, because how could there be? If everyone knew every true fact, then no one could possibly be wrong about anything. And so no one could disagree, because everyone would have to know the truth about every single issue. So, but there are disagreements. Just as a matter of fact, there are disagreements. So lots of true statements are not known by at least some people. So there are lots of true statements that we don't know and may never know. So truth is not a sufficient condition for knowledge. Just because something is true, that doesn't mean that you know it. The fact that something's true is not by itself sufficient for knowledge. You need a lot more than just the fact that something's true in order to know something, right? Either there are an even number of molecules in the earth, or there's an odd number of molecules in the earth. I don't know which of those is true, but one of them is. One of them's true, but who knows which one? Nobody knows. So there are true things that are not known. So the fact that something is true is not by itself sufficient for it to be known by anybody. So truth is a necessary condition for knowledge, but it is not a sufficient condition for knowledge. Now, we've said that truth is a necessary condition for knowledge, and I sort of suggested that belief might also be a necessary condition for knowledge. Because how could you know something without believing it? We can ask, is it possible to know something without believing that it's true? And it looks like the answer to that is no. If you know for a fact that the earth is round, that means that you think the earth is round. In other words, you believe that the earth is round. It would be crazy to say, I know that the earth is round, but I believe that it is flat. That's incoherent. Why? Because knowing something means that you also believe it. You have to believe something in order to know something. You can't say, I know it's not raining, but I believe that it is. That would be insane. That would be nonsense. Because the only way to know something is to think that it's true and to be right. And maybe some other conditions that we'll talk about. But at minimum, in order to know something, it looks like you have to believe that it is true, and you have to be right. It has to actually be true. So belief and truth are both necessary conditions for knowledge. The only way to know something is to believe it and be right. Now, maybe you also need other stuff. But at minimum, necessary conditions for knowledge: truth and belief. You have to believe whatever it is, and it has to be true. It has to actually be correct. So we have to have a true belief in order to have knowledge. True belief is a necessary condition for knowledge. But is it sufficient? Is true belief sufficient for knowledge? Once you have true belief, does that guarantee that you have knowledge? So we all have beliefs. I believe the earth is round. Some flat earther conspiracy theorists believe the earth is flat. If the earth really is round, which it is, then my belief that the earth is round is true. It's a true belief. Now, ordinarily, we don't just say that we have a true belief that the earth is round. We don't normally say, I have a belief that I have hands and my belief happens to be true. We say, we know the earth is round. We say, I know I have hands. We have knowledge about the shape of the earth. And that seems right. But the fact that we have true belief might not by itself mean that we have knowledge. So consider belief in God, for example. Some people say things like, no one knows whether or not there's a God, but I personally believe that there is or isn't, depending on whatever that person believes. So some people say, I believe that there's a God, or I believe there isn't a God, but no one knows for sure. No one can prove it one way or the other. No one knows for sure whether or not there's a God, but I believe there is, or I believe there isn't. I believe there's no God. I believe there is a God. Different people have different beliefs. But now, regardless of whether or not you agree that no one knows whether or not there's a God, maybe you think some people know. Maybe you think you know. But whether or not you agree, it's at least coherent to say that the person who says no one knows whether or not there's a God, but I personally believe there is a God, or I personally believe there's no God, that person is not speaking absolute nonsense the way they would be if they said, like, it's not raining, but I happen to know that it is raining. Like, that would be nonsense. That person has contradicted themselves. But when someone says no one knows whether or not there's a God, but I believe there is, or I believe there isn't, that person hasn't contradicted themselves. They're not speaking incoherently. What they have said is not nonsense. It might be false, but it isn't nonsense. But if knowledge is just true belief, if knowledge is nothing more than true belief, then what they've said is nonsense. Because lots of people believe there's a God, and lots of people believe there isn't a God. And one of those groups is right. I'm not saying which one, but one of them is. Either there's a God or there's not. Those are the only two choices. All right, let's put it this way. Either there are no gods or there's at least one God. Right? That's just math. Either it's zero or it's more than zero. Those are the two choices. So one of those groups is right. People who think there's at least one God, or people who think there are zero gods. One of those groups is right. One of those groups has a true belief. So if true belief is all it takes to have knowledge, then one of those groups knows. One of those groups has knowledge, because one of those groups has a true belief. Either there is at least one God, and the group that thinks that is correct and has a true belief, or there is no God, and the group that thinks that has a true belief. So one of those groups has a true belief about whether or not there's a God, or whether or not there's at least one God. So if knowledge is just true belief, then the idea that no one knows whether or not there's a God is nonsense. That's absolutely false if knowledge is just true belief. It's not even coherent to believe that. Because if you say, no one knows whether or not there's a God, but I believe there is a God, then you think that you have a true belief, but not knowledge, which, if knowledge is just true belief, is nonsense. You can't, if knowledge is just true belief, then it's nonsense to think that you have a true belief but don't have knowledge. And the person who says no one knows, but I believe there is, or I believe there isn't, that person is claiming that no one, including them, has knowledge. So they don't know, but have a true belief. And if we think it's even coherent to think that you have a true belief, but you don't know for sure, well, then knowledge can't be true belief. It has to be something more, because there has to be some gap there between true belief and knowledge, where you can have true belief, but you don't yet have knowledge. So knowledge is somehow stronger than true belief. You can have a true belief and still not have knowledge. That's at least coherent. That's at least possible. Maybe you think that all of your true beliefs are knowledge. Maybe they are. Probably not. Almost definitely not. But maybe they are. But it's at least possible to have a true belief that doesn't count as knowledge. And as long as that's possible, knowledge must be something stronger than belief. And so what is this added strength? What is the difference between knowledge and true belief? Well, that's the question we want to answer. What is this added strength that knowledge has over true belief? Because we've said that true belief is necessary for knowledge, but not sufficient. So knowledge guarantees true belief, but true belief does not guarantee knowledge. So there's some extra condition that must be met. True belief is necessary but not sufficient. So there must be some added condition which, when combined with true belief, will be sufficient for knowledge. And that's what we're going to investigate next. And that's what we will talk about in the next video. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.